Nisqually is lived on Muddy Creek. He lived about a mile, best I can nail him, from Snow's Island. Nisqually would be one of the men killed or hung at Fort Mott for being Colonel Doyle's guide. Mrs. Nisqually lived in the area after the war. She wasn't chased out. But he's obviously, and the other thing about him is the family never interacted with anybody. I have no connection with Nisqually with any of the other families who intermarried. So he was kind of an outer guy anyway. And you can speculate. Chris Swagger says I don't speculate. I love to speculate. I think he was probably a loyalist, and he was kind of rarefied out of the community during the war, and he probably went to Ralton and said, hey, I know where Marion is. How's that for speculation? Chris? All right, third-tier families. Third-tier families were families that provided food and support for Marion with food and fodder and everything else, or they somehow were otherwise connected with the Francis Marion. But I cannot place them on the landscape other than the most general sense, but I knew they lived in the area. For instance, Warkins. The Warkins, of course, are on Catfish Creek. These are regional names. All right, so we're going to spend a little time on stuff that you like, and that's called Marion's history, war history. We'll spend a little bit of time on that, and then we'll go back and kind of see what we learned from this. First of all, look at the pre-war community, the Kuwait community, and then we'll look at Marion's use of these guys and afterwards. All right, this area settled late, relatively, in the colonial period. Everybody, of course, first settled around Charleston, Georgetown, Low Country. Everybody bought big properties and grew rice in the very early part of the 17th, 18th century. This area, the Welsh moved in. The Welsh didn't like it because the first settlers were always looking for good agricultural land. It wasn't good agricultural land around Snow's Island. Lots of swamps, lots of places, lots of mosquitoes, places you don't want to be. So they moved out. They moved north, upstream, and moved to the Welsh, which is now called the Welsh Neck. This area was later filled in around Snow's Island, Britain's Neck especially, once indigo got started. You didn't need a lot of big, fancy land to grow indigo. You could grow indigo in the swamps. The other thing you could do in the swamps, very cheaply, was you could get some cattle, and you could let them graze out there in the swamps, along with the pigs, and then when you needed them, you threw out some corn or something to bring them in, gather them in, and you captured them and tagged them, released them back out to the swamps, or slaughtered them as you needed it. So this area was rich in beef and hogs. And as a matter of fact, this area was constantly used by Marion and by Greene's Continental Army once he returned to this area to feed his Continental Army. This was a big food basket for the Continental Army. And an important thing about this was these people were involved in the regulator movement of the 1760s. The regulator movement, the simple explanation is there's much more details that Alexi could probably give you to fill in the details, but the bottom line is this. In these areas, you had to go to Charleston to do any business. You wanted to get married, you had to go to Charleston or Georgetown. You wanted to buy property, you had to go to Georgetown, you had to go to Charleston. You couldn't really do that if you were a backcountry person, and so people started getting angry about that. And they kept complaining about that, and of course nothing ever happened. So they took matters into their own hands. They wanted justice of the peace. They wanted courts in case there was a murder, in case there was somebody wanted to sue somebody. And so they took their matter into their own hands. And the regulator movement. They went out, did some vigilante work, rounded up some crooks, and this sort of thing. And in the end, Charleston had to respond by dividing up this backcountry a little bit and establishing some government. That's an interesting idea. If someone rebels, they might be able to establish a government. All right. The Three-Partisan Committee. In 1774, we started seeing the origins of the rebellion. And the important point about this is that these people were going to become important in Francis Marion's partisan army, showing up early as supporters of the Whig cause. People like John James, John Witherspoon, Giles, Potts, Francis Britton, William Snow. These are all names of the community, right? And they're all people who were involved in the First Continental Congress. They go down, they fight, we chase them down to the Fort Moultrie. We find some of them were there. Some of them were captured at Charleston and released later. Some were at the Battle of Fort Moultrie. Those who survived and came back home signed a petition and then continued to support the American Revolution long before Francis Marion ever got there. That's important. And then Marion came and arrived in August of 1780 at Witherspoon's Ferry, took charge of the Williamsburg militia. And over the fall of 1780 and April of 1781, he engaged in a series of raids against the British. And we're not going to go through every one of them, because I'm sure a lot of these things are going to be mentioned elsewhere. The important point is to notice the flow. The flow is, you've got August 1780, you've got Marion going there. He immediately is following Gates's orders, goes down to the Santee and captures the boats and burns the boats along the Santee. Goes up the Great Savannah, recaptures the Continentals, goes back to this area. He crosses the river up the Blue Savannah and back to Port's Ferry. And then he figures he's going to have to get out of the area and runs off into North Carolina. He returns, comes back across Britain's Neck, meets up with the Williamsburg militia, some Williamsburg militia, James, and they go down and fight at Black Mingo and capture the Loyalists there. And then they go back into North Carolina. Then they're going to come back and engage in another series of guerrilla warfare all the time after those engagements to rest and refit, just like Mao says, at, around, and on Snow's Island. So that's the important flow, is that all times he's eventually returning to this area during this period of time, showing the support that was there. It was an area where he could know that his neighbors were going to support him. It was an area where he knew he could get food and forage from the people, and they were providing people. A lot of them were people themselves. A lot of these people were fighting for Marion and returning. Where were they returning? They were returning to this Britain's Neck area. The first mention of Snow's Island comes under Hugh Giles. He goes into that area and orders to have some lead shot delivered to Johnson's Island. That was what was called before it became Snow. Marion shows up there around December 28th and is there for a couple of weeks in January. The camp is there. He comes in and out, but actual sticking around for a while is in January. And of course, sometime during that period, John Early constructs the redoubt at John's Bluff. Okay, and we go into the final stages of the camp. Now we're looking at more strategic things now. At this point, Greene is in the area. Lee and Marion cooperate, go out to Georgetown, but Greene has to retreat again and leaves. Cornwallis leaves him, goes into the North Carolina and chases Greene. It's during this period that Marion's left alone again. He's alone before, now he's alone again. This time, the British have the rebellion subdued enough that they have the opportunity to go after Marion. I don't think the camp was that big a secret. They knew somewhere over there was the camp. They just didn't have the power and the men and to know maybe exactly what was going on to take the opportunity to go over there, because they were concerned with people like a guy named Sumter and other partisans. So they were controlling a large area. But now Sumter's kind of on his own and they have an opportunity. That's March of 1781. And this is Watson's chase. Watson goes after Marion. Everyone knows that. I think a couple of symposiums back there was a long discussion of this. But basically what happens is Watson attempts to get to Snow's Island and destroys the camp, but Marion meets him in constant skirmishes until he gets to the point where he's battered enough, Sandpit Ridge, and has to retreat into Georgetown. Coming back door was Doyle. Doyle had come from Camden area, and it's possible, you know, we talk about this being a two-pronged assault. Yeah, it's quite possible. There's no reason why it shouldn't have been a two-pronged assault. It ended up being a two-pronged assault. I kind of think maybe it wasn't. Maybe there's a possibility that Marion knew about Watson and was chasing and was dealing with Watson. And sometime during that period, those 2 weeks, Waldron finds out where Marion's camp is and then sends Doyle's out. Because in the early part of the month, there's a letter written by Rawdon in which he says that he's hurrying Marion along with Watson. Doesn't mention Doyle. 2 weeks later, he writes another letter and he says, I've got Watson and Doyle on top of it. So it's possible that the reason why Marion didn't know anything about Doyle was that no one knew anything about Doyle. It wasn't a two-pronged assault. It was an opportunity that Rawdon took as this dynamic warfare was going along. After Snow's Island, the important point here is Marion leaves the area, but the people reform. You know, remember that Watson reforms in Georgetown, goes up right up through Britain's Neck, burns out the American, the Whigs there, but is turned away when he finds out that Greene is returning, comes back down to Georgetown. The people immediately reform, and for the rest of the war, they're going to be providing food and water and everything else. And this doesn't really run out until late in 1782. One of Greene's adjutants come through the area and says there just isn't much left. But for a long time, there was a lot of food and forage for the people. All right, let's get on to the archaeology. It looks like I've already used up most of my time, but I've got about 10 minutes, right, George? Okay. All right, let's look at this and see if there's anything on the landscape we want to look at. Well, first of all, most of these ferries have some colonial occupation somewhere about them that we know about or we found as a result of some funding we got from the Francis Marion Trail Commission, who sponsored a lot of this research, I should add, real quickly. And some work that I had done previously. We're going to talk about some of these sites very quickly. Not much about Witherspoon's Ferry. I do know there's a colonial site there. It's destroyed. The Golden Factory pretty much took it out. Port's Ferry was. We found material there on the west side. We've been looking for the redoubt on the right side for quite some time. I think it's gone. I think it's been destroyed. Although it does get confused in the history with the Dunn's Bluff redoubt. Goddard's Plantation C is a work that I had done back in the late 80s, early 90s on a colonial site, which is definitely Goddard's post-war plantation. And I think probably there's some evidence of the colonial period there, but it's a bit speculative also. And then, of course, Dunn's Bluff being the big one, Hickory Hill, and the Tan Yard. These are all sites, colonial archaeological sites in the area. Dunn's Bluff was the big one. In history, that is later history, post-Revolutionary War history, if you look at some of the resources in history, Dunn's Bluff gets mixed up with Francis Marion's Snow's Island camp, to the point where it may be that this is Francis Marion's camp, even though it's not on Snow's Island, but across from Snow's Island. Snow's Island, in a lot of cases, was not so much a location of a precise camp, but a kind of a mailbox. That is, if you were going to go to Francis Marion's camp on Snow's Island, or around Snow's Island, you went to the mouth of Lynch's Creek, and you were found by Marion's men, and they took you to the camp. So, and the camp probably moved around, but we have not been able to find anything on Snow's Island that provides any evidence of a camp being there, but this may be there across from Snow's Island, which on Mill's Atlas is called Marion's Camp, across from Snow's Island. Mill doesn't help anywhere at all. I've been through all his papers in the National Archives, in the South Carolina Archives. In his statistics, he talks about the camp being, talks about Snow's Island. He talks about the camp on Snow's Island. 2 pages later, he talks about special places. And then he talks about the camp being across from Snow's Island. So he contradicts himself. And I've been back to the original source, his original draft, and it still says the same thing. Anyway, we did find a camp right here. And we did some archaeology, found a nice cannonball, 3-pounder with a nice British broad arrow on it, a wonderful silver-plated, actually the whole sterling stuff, complete silver eye button, probably from one of Marion's officers. With the stirrup, we got another stirrup, Luther. And of course the candlestick. We did a lot of work there on the lots of that shot. We've got the nice feature that shows that Marion was not living on sweet potatoes, but was enjoying fine hogs and beef and deer and oysters. He enjoyed a few oysters. And we have this nice feature which we think that might possibly be a palisade. This looks just like the palisade we've seen from other places. The palisade being a fortress kind of place, so there may be a fortified position there. And then there's this redoubt. Robert Bass talks about the redoubt and how he used to take the kids there. And I'd seen that for years. It's like when I first started going on Snows Island, we found that pretty quickly. But I always looked at that, and it didn't look like a redoubt to me. It looked like maybe some sort of agricultural place. And it's in a crazy place. It's here, this is the PD River. Yeah, it's the PD River, and there's Stone's Bluff. And it's back behind the bluff. What's it protect? Try to talk about that in a minute. The important thing is that I knew that Charles Baxley, if I was here working, he was going to someday say to me, "Did you look at the redoubt?" And I'd have to say, "No, Charles, I forgot to do that." So I didn't want that to happen. So I said one day to Sean Taylor and I, we said, "Let's go look and see if we can do anything about the redoubt," quote unquote. And so we spent a day and we hogged a profile right through that baby. And there is a nice organic level right here showing where the original ground surface was. There's no doubt there's shovel marks right there showing dirt was purposely thrown up here. We found a bullet mold in the middle of it. It's the redoubt that Robert Bass is talking about. It's Marion's redoubt that was built. You can debate whether or not it's actually the Port's Ferry redoubt. Some people are going to claim that that's not true, but it's confusing. Now, going back to the tactical part of this, and you can